Hi, and welcome to another edition of All Politics is Local. I'm your host, John Featherston. On tonight's episode of All Politics is Local, we're talking about the 2024 ballot questions. There's 5 questions on the ballot, and if you haven't been paying attention, there's a lot that we're going to go over tonight. Question 1 is going to be the state auditor's authority to audit the legislature. I think that one pretty much makes common sense. Question 2 is getting a lot of media play right now, the elimination of the MCAS as a high school graduation requirement. Question 3 is unionization for transportation network drivers. Question 4, this could be an interesting one, a limited legalization and regulation of certain natural psychedelic substances. Maybe we'll touch on that in a future episode. And tonight we have an expert. We have Chris Lane, the former political director of Mass GOP and a pollster for Signal, to talk about minimum wage for tipped workers. Chris, welcome to All Politics is Local.
John, thanks for having me. Good to see you.
Hey, it's a pleasure. Good to see you again. Thanks for coming in.
Absolutely.
So question 5. Sounds pretty simple, sounds pretty good. If you're a tipped worker, you're going to maybe get a pay raise. So it sounds good.
Yeah, if you get 4 seconds into the conversation, the story really changes. But the idea is that a radical group from California came in called One Fair Wage, and their idea was to raise the minimum wage of tipped workers. And again, who doesn't want to see their local bartender down at the local spot make good money and make a livable wage? Everybody wants that.
Absolutely, yeah.
But when you dig just an inch deeper on what this question actually does, it takes the minimum wage and puts it to $15 an hour. And then the restaurant's responsible for that. So first, it's bad for restaurants because every single full-time employee that'll cost restaurants $18,500 per employee.
Wow.
Second, for the servers themselves, all of their tips now go into what they call a tip pool. So they are no longer receiving, when you fill out that check, when that money is supposed to go to them, that will no longer be the case. It will go into a giant pot and then be redistributed throughout the entire restaurant. So servers will make less money. Bartenders will make less money. That's a fact, not an opinion. And then the third part of it is just bad for communities and for consumers. This has been tried in other places. This has been tried in Washington, D.C. In the first 6 months this was tried in Washington, D.C., 10% of the restaurant industry went out of business. So that costs thousands of jobs. Each one of those buildings that houses these restaurants go vacant. Downtowns are decimated. And this is just bad all around. It's bad policy. It's not what these workers want. It's being driven by a very, very, very radical progressive group from California.
So let's break it down. I mean, come out of COVID, due to inflation, everything is more expensive in a restaurant or a bar right now. To-go containers, price of food, supplies, a good employee is more expensive than it used to be. So number one, you have restaurants that are really just hanging on, if they're lucky. And very few, unfortunately, are probably flourishing. So this adds, your words, $18,500 per employee expense to somebody who's trying to hold on right now with his fingernails to his business. So immediately it's going to put, a small little mom and pop place out of business.
And that is precisely who it hurts the most.
Right.
The big chains might be able to afford this. Mm-hmm. The super wealthy high-end restaurants will probably be okay. It is your middle-class family restaurants that simply won't survive it. This will cost the average family restaurant between $250,000 and $350,000 a year. And ask any one of those owners and operators, there is not $300,000 extra sitting in their margins.
No, not at all.
And so we're gonna be driven into this world where it's only gonna be takeout and Chipotle and these fast service places or your high-end restaurants. The middle-class American restaurant will disappear from Massachusetts, and it will be absolutely devastating for every community across the state.
So you must talk to bartenders, waiters, waitresses. I mean, what's the feedback that you're getting from them?
Yeah, so I've been working on this campaign for the better part of a year, and when I first started talking to bartenders about the question itself, very few people even knew it was happening. Mm-hmm. But instantly, once they learned what it was, I've had literally unanimous consent that this is a bad idea. I know that sounds hyperbolic, but I have now asked this to hundreds of tipped workers in restaurants, and I can't find one that's in favor of this. So the people that this is quote unquote designed to help are the people that unanimously reject it.
So the wait staff doesn't want it. The bartenders don't want it. Quite obviously, no owner wants $300,000 added to his bottom line. So you mentioned this group out of California. What's their motive?
Their motive is they believe, like most progressive groups, that everything is, the system stacked against us, and the big bad restaurant owners are being greedy, and that should be the wealth should be redistributed across the whole spectrum here. And the fact of the matter is that the people who live and work in restaurants, the people who will be impacted the most, are going to be hurt by this the most. Ask any waiter, waitress, bartender, they know that their income will go down, not up, because of this. And that's where, on paper, just reading this, it sounds like a pay increase.
Right.
It is fundamentally a pay decrease.
So let's drill down a little bit on one thing that you said, and let's get into the details a little bit. So now, if you're a waiter or a bartender, you might have to, tip out like a busboy or a bar back or something like that now. Under this new plan, all tips will go into a pool, and then restaurant management gets to decide how that, so he could give $100 to the dishwasher that night, which I'm not saying is a bad thing, but I mean, you earn the tips for your good service. But now you can now dictate even like where your money goes. Is that what I'm hearing correctly?
You are completely subjected to everyone else's work ethic and how they work with their customers. And imagine this too. The average restaurant in DC now has a service fee included in this. And so what they've seen, the numbers in tips have gone down. Also, when you're tipping about your experience with your waiter or waitress, with your bartender. Once you know that money is not going towards them, the natural human thing is you're going to tip less.
You're going to tip less. Oh,
and,
absolutely.
And where's the incentive for that waiter, waitress, bartender to provide excellent service start to finish when you know that money is just going to go somewhere else? And so in a post-COVID world where the service industry has been through so much, we're now going to put them through this too. It's just a bad idea.
All right, so let's a yes vote on this would increase the minimum hourly wage an employer must pay a tip worker to the full state minimum wage implemented over 5 years. So it would start in 2005 and max out in 2029, at which point employers could pool all tips and distribute them to all non-management workers. So that's one good thing, and the management doesn't get any. A no vote would make no change in the law governing tip pooling or minimum wage for tip workers. So currently in Massachusetts, a tipped employee, please tell me if I'm wrong, what do they make, $6.25 an hour?
I think it's $6.75.
$6.75.
But don't quote me on there. It's somewhere in that ballpark.
Right. So it's not the minimum wage of which is 15. So it would be a sliding scale from 2025 to 2029. Is that tip pool not go in till 29, or does that start in 2025?
It would start immediately.
It would start immediately.
And the other...
So that's even worse.
It's even worse. The other part that, again, and I had no idea this was the case before I started on this work, the $6.75 minimum wage, if you went to work that night and you did not make $15 an hour with your tips, it is already mandated by state law that your employer has to make it up for it. So the idea that you're only making $6.75 an hour is also fundamentally untrue, because if for whatever reason, slow night, empty restaurant, bad tipping, whatever the thing may be, if you don't make $15 an hour, it is the law that your employer already has to make it up. So this is where I have a really hard time understanding the other side. And, John, we're Massachusetts Republicans. We typically have to understand where the other side's coming from in order to get things done. And even though I may not agree with it often, I can rationally bring myself to understand what the motivation is. I simply can't do it on this one because it just doesn't make sense.
You beat me to it, because I was going to say the law is already in place that if you didn't make the money tonight, your employer has to, compensate you. send you home, and you still have to make minimum wage. So I really don't there's more to this than meets the eye, I think. Is this like a step one of this progressive group coming in, and is this a way for them to eventually maybe unionize all restaurants? I mean,
so yeah, they have a whole bunch of goals in mind, and in fact they've gone after this in almost a dozen states across the country. Most states have actually thrown this off the ballot because of it's unconstitutional in a lot of ways, especially the idea of taking people's money and redistributing it to others. But this is where I love the fact that it's on the ballot here in Massachusetts, because from their perspective, outside of maybe California and a few other states, they see Massachusetts as a layup. They see this as an opportunity to get the ball rolling and have this progress into every state they possibly can. And that's where I love Massachusetts voters. We have a long history of, sure, we're blue in nature, but we have a long history to standing up to craziness.
That's true.
And
True.
we've displayed that by having Republican and Democratic governors, Republican and Democratic senators. And here's a great opportunity to fundamentally reject a progressive idea that does not move our state forward. It moves it backward, and it destroys an industry. It doesn't help it.
So you must be talking with Mass Restaurant Association. I mean, what's their stance on all of this?
Yeah, Mass Restaurant Association has been spearheading this effort, the No on 5 campaign, and I can't say enough about the people there and frankly, restaurant workers across the state. As you mentioned, I'm a pollster, and I've done some polling work here. If you look at the favorable, unfavorable of people who work in restaurants, bartenders, tip workers, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 75-5. People love their industry workers. And my biggest fear is the great people in that industry will have no choice but to go do something else because they simply won't be able to support themselves the way that they always have.
Right. So, I mean, speaking, personally, I was in the hospitality business for many, many years. I mean, I worked my way through college, working tips, and, I'm like, tuition's due. I got to go out and work X amount of shifts to make you're going to lose that ability. You're going to lose it. More importantly, you're going to any good waiter wants to provide excellent service because they understand at the end of that meal or the end of that drink, they provide great service. They're going to get well compensated. They might not get 20%, but they're going to get 15%. They might not always get 30%, but they know if they build that.
Yeah.
They're building return business because you always want to go back to that bartender or waitress that takes care of you. It's just human nature. And you become friendly with them, you become concerned about them, so you're going to maybe tip them a little bit more. You're going to eliminate that entire floor right there. And the restaurant owner is going to add $300,000 to his bottom line. Like you said, it's just going to put him out of business. So let's talk about, because all politics is local. You lose we're taping here in Ashland, Massachusetts, a mid-sized town in Massachusetts. Let's look at a mid-sized town because Ashland's a good comp for most of Massachusetts. If Ashland lost 5 restaurants, we wouldn't have any restaurants. Then you flip it to Boston, and let's just say you lost only 20 restaurants because of this. What does that do to the landscape in Boston, though, too? Are you going to lose, some businesses down on Newbury Street? Are you going to lose businesses, in the South End or in the North End? What would that impact be already? The fight with the mayor in the North End in Boston right now. That they have to pay for other stuff that, for outdoor seating that other organizations don't. You add another $300,000. You could lose an institutional, like a well-known institutional restaurant in the North End just based on this. I mean, it doesn't make any sense.
So let's talk about Boston, because this is an interesting angle that we've been thinking a lot about. Mayor Wu, in an effort to help black and brown communities, has created a whole lot more liquor licenses that are going to be used in Boston.
And a crazy amount of liquor licenses.
A huge amount.
Right.
And regardless of that fact of whether that's good or bad or indifferent, I think it's 225 liquor licenses.
I think you're right, yeah. More.
The threshold that this will create in order to even open a restaurant will be so enormously high, it'll put it out of reach. You could create 10,000 liquor licenses. It's a fake number. It's fraudulent because no one will be able to afford to open these places to have them function. And so if the idea is to say that you want to help disenfranchised people get off the ground and really help themselves in their community. So now you're going to implement this idea that will make it even more difficult. And by the way, the restaurant industry is notorious for being really hard as is,
right?
And how quickly they open and close. And so now, it's going to make it that much harder to open them. And then if you do, you're going to create an extra $300,000 a year to that bottom line to try to make up for. The margins on these things are already so small. In fact, I won't be able to cite the specific study, but I read the other day that the gap between making food at home and the margin on that food and the food at the restaurant is tighter than it's ever been. And so it's not like restaurants are cleaning up off people here. They're doing everything they can to keep prices as low as possible because they've gone up so much already. And so it's just really, it's hard for me to understand how we got to this point. And frankly, the legislature punted this because they didn't think it was a good idea. If they thought it was a good idea, they would have voted for it themselves.
You talk to any restaurant owner, Democrat, Republican, Independent, whatever, they're all going to tell you they pass their costs on to the consumer.
They have no choice.
They have no choice. That's what they have to do.
Right.
Just to-go containers alone, I have a good friend who owns a few Asian restaurants. He's like, I can't even afford to buy to-go containers anymore, paper products anymore, because the margins are so ridiculous. When I'm spending more on, to-go containers because of inflation, not on top of what I have to pay for chicken wings now or what I have to pay for liquor now, it's putting me out of business. Adding this to them will only accelerate it. But any restaurant, as I'm saying, will tell you that I pass my costs right on to my consumer. So that $300,000 is going to be added to every restaurant, and it doesn't matter how big or small the restaurant is. It's going to be about $300,000. Who do you think is going to pay for that? So that $30, to-go order that you got now, it's going to be $35. It's going to be $38. And the restaurant is going to be like, whoa, I got to pass it along to somebody. Eventually, the money runs out. Socialism is a great idea until other people's money runs out. That's what we're kind of looking at right here.
It's precisely what we're looking at. And I think the other part of this that we have to remember is those who have studied this and where it has been implemented, they've seen prices gone up about 20%. And there's a whole bunch of people who, most of us can only go out to eat so often anyway.
Right.
If it's 20% more than that, you're going to go out even less than you already are. And then we create this ripple effect of restaurants not only making less money because of the margins, but less money because people won't be able to come in because it'll be 20% more. And then you'll have waiters and waitresses and bartenders who will make less because people aren't coming in as often. And round we go. So it's a never ending sea of problems. And I hate to belabor the point. I can typically try to come to a reasonable middle on a whole lot of issues and understand where both sides are coming from with good intentions for good things. And on this one, it's bad for consumers. It's bad for servers. It's bad for restaurants. It's bad for communities. So I don't know who wins if question 5 passes.
You brought up a point earlier, though, too, is with, the expansion of like Amazon, you go to the mall nowadays, mall traffic is way off, and a lot of malls are closing, maybe even becoming Amazon fulfillment centers and so forth. You start losing restaurants in your community, you're not going to fill them back up. They're just going to sit vacant. So what does that do to your downtown district? What does that do to your appearance of your town? Like, you have empty restaurants, you have empty storefronts. Are people thinking about that? Is that coming up in your polling or anything?
Yeah, it's something we've talked about a lot, and we actually did some focus groups around this and how people felt. And the overwhelming sentiment was that initially we like the idea of supporting these people, but once we get to those types of consequences, imagine if 10% of the restaurant industry closes, and that means 10% of those buildings are now vacant. And what that means for the buildings nearby and the other shops nearby and the parking nearby and just everything. And we talk about this all the time with, high taxes and the ripple effect that has. That's essentially what we're talking about here. We're going to strangle businesses that then will have to raise money in other ways and by charging more to consumers. And then waiters and waitresses won't get the same cut that they're used to getting for the hard work that they do. And, like you, I worked in a restaurant in high school, and it was one of the hardest things I've ever done.
Right.
And it's just extremely difficult. And the reason they get paid far more than the average person, far more than minimum wage, by the way, is because of how hard it is.
Right.
And the idea of making minimum wage is supposed to be a selling point to these hardworking people? I don't think so. What we found is most restaurant workers make $20, $25, $40 an hour, which is much more conducive to their lifestyle that they need in order to survive.
Right. It's being in the restaurant business is not for everybody. I think everybody should work in it because you can learn a lot about, the human race by working in the restaurant and dealing with people in difficult situations. But if you're a good person, you can make a very good career and make a six-figure income.
No question.
In the right industry, and kudos to you for doing so. But you're not going to be making six figures anymore if your manager is going to decide how he's going to break up your tip pool. So it doesn't make any sense. So you're here today to say no on question 5.
I am. And think about also, just to close up here.
Sure.
Think about how hard it was for restaurants to reopen post-COVID because they couldn't find the bodies, right? And so now, if this happens, the people most inclined to leave are your older, more experienced, high-level employees. And think about the incredible drop-off of service you're going to have if those people leave, and then who will be there to fill in that gap? It'll either be A, no one, or B, someone who's not going to provide the same experience for the consumer, for the restaurant that we're used to seeing.
And if you didn't go out of business when you lost that good guy, you're definitely going to go out of business because your service standards have gone down and people aren't going to pay for it anymore.
I can't tell you how many restaurants I go to because of the service that I perceive from certain people, especially the individuals. Forget the entities. The individual servers make those experiences what they are. For me, I'd rather go to a restaurant with B+ food with A+ service than A+ food and D service.
Right there with you.
It's about that experience. And if we take away from that experience, which this will fundamentally do, we're going to have a real problem on our hands.
So we've talked for years on this program about, all politics is local, and, you've got the big one on November 5th. Of course, you've got Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump. I have said for years that it's the local issues that have bigger impacts on you, your friends, your family, your kids' education. We've got a couple minutes left here, so let's just run down the 5 questions that are going to impact Massachusetts in the 24 election. Question 1, state auditors' authority to audit the legislature. My words, no brainer.
Yeah, WBUR and Mass Inc. just put out a poll yesterday that showed this is going to pass overwhelmingly. And I think it's a great thing. The only thing I find ironic is that they had to work so hard for this to happen. The auditor, whose job is to audit, wanted to audit the legislature and was met with every resistance on earth, which forced her to do this ballot question. And it's nice to see, transparency wins for once.
I've had people come up to me and go, it doesn't already happen? Like, how can this not already happen? I mean, we can do a whole program about, sunshine laws don't, and open meeting laws don't, are in effect to the legislature. But I think it would be good if people just know. I mean, I could understand why the legislature doesn't want somebody to look at their books, but I think the public wants, how is my money being spent? I think it's a simple no-brainer one.
Seems like a pretty reasonable ask.
Pretty reasonable ask. Question 2, elimination of MCAS as a high school graduation requirement.
Yeah. Again, that same poll that came out, and then, from people that I talked to who are working on these things, that's going to be incredibly tight. Yes. I think you're going to see that one fall much more on partisan lines. Democrats and teachers unions in particular are fighting like hell to do this and
to get rid of it.
To get rid of it.
Right.
And your more Republican leaning voters, not necessarily registered Republicans, but but Republican-leaning voters like the accountability. And if you're not measuring what you're doing, how can you determine whether you're being successful or not? So I think that's going to be really close. I think the amount of money that's going to be spent over the next 40 days on this question is going to be astronomical. We'll see how it plays out.
Just this week, it came out that last year's MCAS were not good. We're not good. So is it that the teachers union is kind of pushing this? Let's get rid of this because it makes the teachers union. I don't think it makes teachers look bad, but I think it makes the teachers union look a little bit bad if MCAS scores keep going down.
Yeah, and we have to create a difference between teachers and teachers unions because
absolutely.
it's fundamentally different. And it turns out when you close schools for years on end that it may or may not have had an impact on kids' ability to learn. And now we're seeing the results of that. And just because we don't like the results, we're going to eliminate the test tells us that?
I mean, I think it opens up another can of worms that for 2.5 years, you had kids, learning on a computer. I'm just speaking personally. I wouldn't have learned anything, going to school virtually and everything. But I just think it also enhances that there's a mental health crisis in this country right now. And, there are a lot of 11, 12-year-old, 13-year-old kids who only know school by, a Zoom screen. They got to be messed up. And we need to, kind of reevaluate what's going on with our youth because they're never going to get that back. So
I won't attribute this quote to anyone only because I don't want them to have to deal with what I'm saying now. But when I was an intern at the State House at 17 years old, I had a politician who I very much like and respect say that the Massachusetts Teachers Association is the modern day mafia. And he was being hyperbolic. I don't actually think that, but his point was that the tremendous power that they yield and how much they're able to influence it. And so this is going to be a real test of that between now and November.
Going to be interesting. Question 3, unionization for transportation network drivers, which is that a fancy way of saying Uber and Lyft drivers?
Yeah, exactly right. From what I see and read, it sounds like this is going to pass as well. Probably by some sort of margin of close to 60-40, if I had to guess.
Okay. Question 4, the limited legalization and regulation of certain natural psychedelic substances. So basically mushrooms.
Yeah, this one's interesting, and it's going to be really close, and all the early polling has indicated so. It sort of goes back to the conversation we were having 6, 4, 8, 10 years ago about medical marijuana and should it be able to be used in that sense? And if you're going to do it, should it be regulated and try to make sure that it's been doing it in the right way? So, there's a sound argument on both sides for this one that I think we'll see how it plays out, and we'll see how the money flows in on this side, on this too. Because if we're being frank about how these things work, there's one side that, desperately wants to see this happen because they have financial benefits of it happening. And this is where no campaigns are difficult sometimes because it's hard to consolidate people against an idea when there's no natural base to do that. On question 5, for example, this will destroy restaurants.
Right.
So restaurants are highly incentivized to come together. And that's where I'm curious if the money will have a real impact on this down the stretch to see where that one lands.
Just personal anecdote, when I was the chairman of the Board of Health in my community, I had concerns about the legalization of cannabis and marijuana, not because what you do in the safety of your own home, and I've never worried about that. I was worried that the state didn't have a plan in place. And you kind of fast forward now, you can't tell me the Massachusetts Cannabis Commission has their things in place because they don't have any leadership. They have chaos on their own board. Tell me why this wouldn't happen with this too.
I don't think.
Where's the jurisdiction of this going to be under?
Yeah,
the Cannabis Commission.
I don't have a good answer for you. So
I don't think anybody does.
Yeah.
So it's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out.
We'll see how public perception plays on this because obviously, where marijuana started 10 years ago, where it is now, are drastically different places. So is there a spillover effect of acceptance on that front, or is there some fear of the possible repercussions? Any
feedback you've heard from local law enforcement, public safety individuals on this?
It would be disingenuous. I haven't talked to those folks to say enough about that.
And neither have I, because this one's not getting a lot of ads right now. Maybe in the next 40 days it'll pick up. And then once again, Chris Lane, upholsterer with Signal. You're here today mostly to talk about minimum wage for tip workers. One thing that we didn't add, and I was interested in, this is also like nail salons and it's not just necessarily 100% restaurant and bartenders. It's other like tipped employees as well too.
Nail salons, hair salons. I mean, there's a whole bunch of other things. I think just most people identify it with restaurants,
Right.
and that probably is the large bulk of it. But you're absolutely right. This goes way beyond just restaurants. And my fear is what's next on that front. And
I can tell you personally, if my wife lost her favorite bartender or a waitress, she'd be upset about it, but she'd be really upset if her nail lady left the business because, that woman walks on water as far as my wife is concerned. And, we joke about it, but it's important to my wife and it's important to a lot of people. So, yeah.
We talk about sitting at a bar and getting a drink and having that personal experience. What's more intimate and personal than what you just described? And I can tell you right now, getting my wife to go anywhere other than the spot she goes with her lady is an impossible pitch as well. So yeah, this has huge implications. I would just encourage people, even if you don't agree with everything I've said today or you've said today, just look into this idea, see who's funding the other side and what their goals are. Because this was not created in Massachusetts. This was not an uprising of workers in Massachusetts. This was not tipped workers coming together and say, whoa, we don't like the way this is going. It's the exact opposite of that. It's an outside group who's coming in and trying to dictate what's best for other people. And unfortunately for them, what's best for the people of Massachusetts is the exact opposite of what they're trying to do.
There you go. Chris Lane, upholsterer with Signal, talking about the ballot questions. The election's a big one this year. Tuesday, November 5th. You got to get out. You've got to get your information. One nice thing that Massachusetts does is they do mail this to all the registered voters. Take your time. If we piqued your interest tonight, learn more what's on the ballot because this is the real important stuff, folks. So get out there. And as I always say, if you don't vote, you don't get a chance to complain, but you do have an opportunity to vote on November 5th. You've been watching All Politics is Local right here on WACA, and we'll be back again real soon.